Namaste. Amen. Blessed be. Our story from the Time for All Ages talked about 4 different paths in creation. There's a path of wonder, a path of emptiness, a path of making, and a path of coming home. The thing I really appreciate about this story, especially as a children's story, is that it talks about the richness and complexity of human experience. There's a lot more going on here than just the sin of Adam and Eve and an experience of rejection. And there are a lot of different ways that we respond to beauty and nature and the looming environmental crisis in our midst. As I realized that this week, I came to think more about our Universalist tradition and the way it offers us a model of how we might respond both to the beauty and to the fear of our time. Universalism at its root is a belief that no one would be damned to punishment forever. It's a belief that salvation is offered to everyone, universally. But of course, for theology to come alive or to make much sense, you have to understand its historical context. Universalism arose out of a very scary time in American theology in the 1700s. It was the Calvinist majority of the day believed that God preordained the fate of every living soul, either to eternal heaven or eternal suffering and punishment in a fiery hell. It should be no surprise that we Americans took this belief with special fervor. This time in American history was called, and I think somewhat ironically, the Great Awakening. The hallmark of that time, for literary purposes, comes in the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It stated, it was very clear that God could cast the wicked at any time into hell. And the wicked deserved it. And, most importantly, no one should think themselves safe from God's wrath, ever. It's terrifying. People were afraid, not just for themselves, but they were also afraid for the people that they loved. They were afraid for the souls of their children and for generations to come. This was the worldview that Universalism grew out of. Universalists said, but hold on a minute. That can't be right. I know some really wonderful people. We believe in a loving God. We believe that God, in fact, is so loving that God would offer a hope for everyone eventually. Universalists were simply enamored with this perfectly loving God. So do you see some of the parallel here between Universalism and our experience with the environment? Both our response to the earth and the Universalist response to God run with these deep currents of hope and despair. On the one hand, we recognize that an environmental crisis is at hand. The whole of humanity needs some salvation from the course of mutual destruction that we're on. On the other hand, we also know that we've all received the gift of life from our earth. It's an unearned and miraculous, beautiful gift that we have all received. It's very easy to get sucked down a nihilistic framework to simply say, that's it. We messed that up beyond repair. Game's over for us humans. But as Unitarian Universalists, we have a commitment to hope, even in the face of despair. I'm not talking about denial. I'm not talking about denying global warming or simply ignoring the problem. I'm talking about honest-to-goodness hope for the salvation of our planet. and our Universalist predecessors paved the way for shining hope even in the darkest of times. I want to turn to some of our historical exemplars of Universalism to better understand the faith and to learn how we might be beacons for hope in the midst of this crisis. For a lot of you, the name de Benneville has been on the tips of your tongues this month because you were just up at Camp de Benneville Pines. The camp, our camp, was named after George de Benneville because he was the first person to preach Universalism in America. Like other Universalists, he knew that he had to share his message of hope. Now, he was from Europe, but there he was persecuted in France and Germany and in Holland for his beliefs. At one point in France, he was actually awaiting execution with his head in the guillotine when a government official found some mercy and returned him back to prison. After some scary time in Europe, needless to say, he decided that America might be a better fit. So he settled with a group of German pietists who held Universalist beliefs outside of Philadelphia. He never really established a Universalist congregation in America, but he was very clearly the first person to preach Universalism here. I wanted to speak about him today, not just for the level of risk that he took to speak the truth, but he's an exemplar of Universalism and environmentalism in a way, because he knew deeply that we are all tied in this together. That's what made him see the light, what motivated him. He realized that our faith was all tied up together. In his youth, de Benneville was tortured by these visions. He had nightmares of seeing himself burning in hell. As a child, he was convinced that his sins were too great to be forgiven. But finally, one day, he had a vision of Jesus directly interceding to save him. And he knew at that moment that he was saved. But more importantly, this vision convinced him that others must be saved too. He thought, if an imperfect person like me is saved, then surely everyone else must be. In his heart, George de Benneville found a message of hope, a truth that all is not lost. And he realized that if there's hope for one person, there must be hope for everyone. We're in it together on this little planet, whirling through space. There's no escaping the environmental danger. We don't hear them often, but there have been wonderful stories of hope. They're small stories. One of the small stories that I saw firsthand was when I was living in Laguna Beach. The kelp beds there were restored just a few years ago, and an entire ecosystem restored itself. It was amazing to see marine mammals come back. I had never seen dolphins there, and by the time I left there, they were an everyday occurrence. It was amazing. And just a couple of years ago, we heard the hopeful story of closing San Onofre nuclear power plant. Now, that situation isn't quite wrapped up completely, but both of those stories are profoundly hopeful, not just for Laguna Beach or San Clemente, but for the entire Pacific Ocean and the world. And they're not unique stories. Other little victories are making a difference every day. George de Benneville's understanding of universal salvation reminds me that we're all in this together, that there is hope and the salvation, not of our souls, but the salvation of our planet impacts every single person. Oh, it's impossible to talk about universalism in America without talking about John Murray. You've heard me tell his story before. He's considered the father of American Universalism. The circumstances of his ministry were incredible, but even more striking was his commitment to pursuing a different way. To me, he's a model for holding out space for a hopeful message, even when all around is gloom and despair. I'm talking about hope that we have the capacity as human beings yet to be understood, but a hope that we can alter our lives enough to be sustainable on this planet. It's actually a grand hope, but the alternative is just unacceptable to me. If John Murray could hold a vision of hope for salvation from eternal punishment and a fiery hell, then I suppose we can hold a hopeful vision for salvation of our globe from environmental meltdown. So let me tell a little bit about his story. John Murray converted to Universalism while he was still in England. This is in the 1700s. But shortly after that theological shift, he had some major personal crises. First, his 1-year-old son died. Then shortly after that, his wife got very, very ill, and she also died. Finally, the family home burnt down, and John Murray found himself in debtor's prison from the medical bills. Oh, right, and he was excommunicated from his Methodist church where he preached regularly. He decided maybe God isn't so happy with this universalist idea, and he renounced all of his beliefs and his idea of preaching, and he set off for America. On his way to America, the ship ran aground off the coast of New Jersey, and coincidentally, a farmer there had built a chapel. A farmer named Thomas Potter was waiting for the perfect minister to come along and preach in his empty chapel. And Murray miraculously arrived. It's a bizarre story. But his experience there convinced Potter that this was the message that he had been waiting for, and it convinced Murray that he, in fact, needed to continue his universalist message of hope. He wasn't the first to preach universalism in America, but he was the most influential, mostly because of his powerful preaching style. His message was revolutionary, and it was liberating. It offered a message of hope in a culture of judgment and punishment and despair. Of course, his ideas came with some resistance. Once, when he was preaching in a large church in Boston, a large rock was thrown through the window toward him at the pulpit, barely missing his head. Murray picks up the rock and says, "This argument is solid and weighty, but it is neither rational nor convincing." Laying that stone aside, he announced, "Not all the stones in Boston, except they stop my breath, shall shut my mouth." He was a powerful preacher. He risked his life to make space for a different voice, a voice of hope in the midst of despair. The phrase that's most commonly associated with him, and it's all over our hymnals, was "Give them not hell, but hope." That was the way he commissioned his newly ordained ministers. Give them not hell, but hope. That's what our universalist heritage is about. Give them not hell, but hope. And that is what I want to encourage us to do in relationship with our earth. It's up to us to hold a vision for hope, even if no one else wants to. The last universalist that I want to talk about today is far lesser known. His name is Quillen Shin. His name is sometimes thrown out to stump ministerial candidates in their interviews for ordination. Well, and he's lesser known because he never held a position of great esteem. Instead, he did the grunt work of spreading the good news. Quillen Shin left his settled ministry to be a circuit rider. He would arrive into an unknown town. He would rent a large space to preach in and pass out flyers about a meeting. He'd preach to whoever showed up and encourage them to bring a friend the next night. And he always tried to leave some sense of organization in place before he moved on to the next town. Maybe it was a whole congregation or a Sunday school or a women's group or a youth group, but something to keep a universalist voice going in that community. He preached in every state in the Union and often in Canada in those years. This was mid-1800s. He traveled 25,000 miles every year in his ministry. He acquainted thousands of people with the ideal of universalism. He recruited hundreds of people to various groups. He built 40 churches and encouraged 30 people into the universalist ministry. Yet few of us know his name. I wanted to lift up Quillen Shin today for doing the little work, for spreading the seed of hope wherever and whenever it was possible. Responding to the environment with hope and commitment doesn't require you to chain yourself to an oil freighter on behalf of Greenpeace. It doesn't even require that you become a leader in the Sierra Club, though that's a very good option. The real work is in creating more hope in small places where it's possible. Hope for our souls and hope for our planet comes from small and persistent conversations. On Thursday night, we gathered here for a Vesper service and we talked about some of the different ways that we connect with the earth. And we talked about the sense of awe and wonder that children somehow still have. They readily appreciate the wonder of little things, of a beautiful color of a flower, or the crispness of a cloud, or softness of a puppy. And one of the parents talked about just a minute before bedtime, asking, how did that flower or rock or wild bunny or that beautiful tree make you feel? Not what did it feel like to you, but how did it make you feel on the inside? It was such an awesome example of instilling hope for our planet in a small, momentary encounter with a child by taking them one step deeper into connection with the earth. How did that beautiful thing make you feel? The activist Joanna Macy writes, each of us can be the catalyst or tipping point by which new forms of behavior spread. There is many different ways of being responsive as there are different gifts we possess. Universalists had a mission to change the world with their message, and they did. They had a profound impact on mainstream Christianity, and their hopeful message led them into all sorts of activism for universal access to education, for prison reform, for abolition of slavery. They were there. Hope and joy in life are not complacent ways of being. I'm not letting you off the hook easily. There's no wishing away global warming or imagining the return of countless species that we've made extinct. Universalist faith, knowing that each and every person is worthy of love, knowing that you're part of a broader fabric of life is not an invitation to sit back and enjoy the show. It inspired generations of women and men to change their world, to make this world align with the overwhelming love that they knew God was all about. So what I want to invite you into today is a deep and abiding hope for our world. Hope that we've not passed a point of no return. I want to invite you into a gratitude for the beauty of creation, gratitude for the beautiful, miraculous, unearned, and unearnable gift of life, so that we join in this great tradition of changing the world around us to reflect our faith, that even if we don't always see it, creation is good. Life is good, and there is a way for us to thrive together, even if we don't see it yet. Amen.